Mixing is seriously not that complicated, but for some reason everyone seems to throw all these terrible pieces of mixing advice out there. So today I'm going to simplify it for you. There's only 3 things you need to do to make your mix downs at the same level as the pros. I'm actually going to share with you a collection of lessons from my Producer Launchpad program. So this is stuff normally only my paid students get access to. If you do want to join my 12-week Producer Launchpad coaching program, you can book a free application call with me below, find out more about the program, and let's see if you're a right fit for it. And I would love to help you create the best possible quality music you can. And with that, let's jump into today's video. So the rapid mixdown method is my recommended method of getting really freaking good mixes with the simplest tools in your arsenal, right? And I really believe in this stuff because I've spent all that time diving into advanced plugins, thinking I need 6 compressors and using different ones in parallel and series to get this fat result when really that was not the answer at all. And I truly believe a good mix is these 3 things in this order. 80% of it comes from fader balancing. The next 10% is EQ and dynamics. That last 10% is fancy stuff like saturation, reverb, multiband compression, right? Fader balancing is crucial, and we're going to be diving deep into fader balancing specifically in the next lesson. But I'm going to give you a bit of a preparation by going through a high-level view of what we're going to be covering over the next few lessons. It's going to take us pretty much to the end of this module now, because this is the stuff you need to understand practically in order to make your mixes really pop. And I really believe if you follow all this stuff, doing the final mix at the end, should take you no more than 1, maybe 2 hours, but generally I would say no more than 1, especially if you're mixing as you go. I think your final mix will be done in under an hour, even as you learn the advanced stuff in week 8, right? So the first thing before you start applying the rapid mixdown method and using these tools in your arsenal is identifying how bad is the mix. Now you can do this either in your final mixdown or at your mini mixdown loop phase. So we're in the loop phase here, like I've covered. And if your track is already a dog's breakfast, it's probably worth doing a fader only mix. And I'm going to be covering a fader only mix in a couple of lessons as well. Basically, you zero out all the faders and you build the mix up from scratch. So you need to identify whether you need that ground zero approach or whether, if it's good, mostly it just needs a little bit of tweaking, right? Generally, most people will just need a little bit of tweaking, but if it really is terrible, there is that nuclear option. So once you've judged the existing mix, then you start to dive into the fader levels in either case. And this is really where you want to spend most of your time. If you've spent 30 minutes doing faders and it's still not quite there, spend another 30 minutes. And keep saving new versions, making the tweaks, seeing if you can hear them, export them, bring them in back into your DAW, compare them side by side so you can actually hear the fader balancing differences. If you're making bigger moves, try smaller ones. Instead of bringing the kick up or down by 3 dB, try 1 dB. Try a little bit of extra clap here. Instead of adding a compressor to your drums, which element is poking out? Turn that element down. If your bass line is, too punchy, maybe it just needs to be turned down. These are the things you need to do, and these are the things you really need to understand when it comes to fader balancing, is that the technical advanced option is probably not the answer. It's probably a simple one. It's either fader balancing or the sound, right? And if the fader's not fixing it, generally speaking, the sound needs to be changed. And so again, going back to the foreground, midground, background idea we covered in the idea generation week, you need to use this in terms of the mix too. Those 3 main elements that you decided in your compositional stage were the main elements, they need to be mixed accordingly. In our track here, for example, and we'll cover this as we go through the next few lessons, what are the 3 main elements? Drums, lead, bass line. Done, right? If I can keep those 3 elements, and obviously particular hits within the drums are going to be more in the foreground than the background, then yeah, we're going to be sweet, right? And so in fader balancing, we could also consider panning and how that applies. We'll talk a bit about panning towards the end of this module, but it's also important to consider. Now, we need to talk about relative fader levels and absolute fader levels. We'll be talking a bit about that later, but just for now, you have to know that yes, the mix has to sound good relative to one another. So the kicks have to be balanced relative to the bass, relative to the keys, relative to the synth, relative to the vocals, relative to the effects, right? And so no matter what your end volume is, the instruments have to be all balanced to each other. But also, you have to consider the objective level of volume. Where is your master hitting, before a limiter? Is it peaking way over 0 dB? Is it really quiet and you have to bring it up with tons of limiting and volume? And whilst there's no specific right or wrong, generally speaking, although I don't recommend clipping the crap out of your track or mixing like at -40, it is important to kind of roughly mix in a range that's going to make your life easier, right? And my recommendation is normally mixing between -6 and 0 dB. If your master's clipping around there, and I'm not fussy, I even think a little bit over 0 dB is fine. You're not going to get clipping unless you don't put a limiter on a master. Doors can handle that extra headroom. You're not going to hear it. As long as it's not like 20 dB over or even like 10 dB over, you'll probably be fine. But I generally like to think -6 dB to 0 dB on my master. That's a good absolute level of volume. Now let's give a high level overview of EQ. We'll talk more about that in the EQ specific lesson, but EQ is the next tool I reach for in my mixing arsenal once the fader balancing is done. It kind of makes sense, right? If your fader balancing is good, which by the way, fader balancing is EQ for your mix. If you want more low end, boost up the kick and bass. If you want more highs, turn the hats and effects up. If you want more mids, turn the vocals and leads up and chords up, right? Pretty simple stuff. But obviously, you want to control the EQ on the individual elements themselves as well. If your track is feeling good, but the kick is just punchy but lacks the low end weight, again, it should be a good sample, but if it's still a good sample and still not there, then bring EQ onto your kick. Bring an EQ on and boost up the lows, boost up the frequencies you need to bring that sound sonically up to where it needs to be. EQ is kind of like fader balancing for different parts of a sound, right? And this is the next tool that's going to sculpt your mix to exactly where it needs to be, as we'll cover. We'll cover how I like to use just high passes most of the time, at least as the first EQ move, because I think that does a lot of the result we're looking for. We'll talk about subtractive bell carts, boosts and shelves and stuff like that as well. The third tool, which comes after EQ, is Dynamics. Now, Dynamics isn't one particular plugin, but it's more of a set of plugins. And the type of one you really you want to use is really dependent on the use case. There's compressors, which compress loud parts of the sound by turning them down. There's limiters, which do the same thing to a very extreme degree. There's clippers, which do the same thing to an even more extreme degree, but can introduce distortion in the process. They're very brutal. Saturators and clippers, by the way, are kind of the same thing. And there's kind of a bunch of different reasons you would want to control dynamics. Again, we'll cover that in the dynamics lesson particularly, but that comes after EQ, after fader balancing, right? If we're getting those two things right and there's still problems with, say, the loudness of an element or there's just inconsistency to an element, that's when compression can come and help us out. And then the last 10% is fancy stuff. This is bus processing, reverb, glue compression on your buses, multi-bend compression on elements, stereo imaging plugins, resonance suppression. Probably stuff we'll more so cover in the advanced week. And that's stuff you don't want to touch until the very, very end of your track, generally speaking. Nothing wrong with using it earlier if you think it's going to help you get a better result, but it's not something I first reach for. And that is the high level overview. Again, we've got fader balancing 80% of the way, EQ and dynamics 10% of the way, fancy stuff the last 10%. If you get those things right early on, everything else is going to fall into place. And so we're going to go through each of those steps and kind of break them down over the next few lessons. To recap, I just said it, the three things: fader balancing, EQ, dynamics, fancy stuff. That's the order to follow. We're going to start with fader balancing in the next lesson, spend the next couple lessons talking about that, and then we'll move our way through. Thanks for listening to this lesson. I'll see you very soon. So let's talk fader balancing, the most important lesson you will watch in this entire module. Right? It seems so simple, yet so many producers overlook this simple method for getting a great mix. Now, if we listen to this idea I've got in its entirety, it has a little bit of fader balancing already applied. We can see here a lot of fader tweaks, especially in the drums, as well as in some of these other music groups and stuff like that. But we can do a little bit more, as we'll discover. But listen to how this sounds with basically just fader balancing. There's hardly any processing on a lot of these sounds, by the way. It's pretty much maybe the occasional EQ, and apart from that, fader balancing, and then a limiter on our master to get it up to scratch, right? So let's listen to that. Now, I haven't specifically gone and done a full fader balance mini mix yet. A lot of this is just me mixing the faders as I go, right? And of course, you may be at a different production skill level watching this. Maybe you haven't developed that ear enough to get quite to this level of quality in a as you go fashion, right? That is okay. Don't feel discouraged, because what you miss out on as you go, you can make up for with deliberate time set aside to do a mix, right? And then the more you set that time aside to do a mini mix or a full mix, you can then get better at doing things on the fly, right? So, for example, let's solo through these elements one by one. I'm actually going to turn off our music. We're going to start with the drums, right? Now, a quick word on fader balancing drums. When starting a mix of any sort, whether it's, again, like a mini mix, just this loop, or a full final mix down at the end of your arrangement, you want to think a little bit differently to maybe how you started the song. You might have started with the lead, or the bass line, or the vocal, whatever. When you start mixing, that element's likely going to be one of the first you mix. However, I always, in 90% of electronic music genres, recommend starting mixing the drums. Why? The drums tend to be that backbone of the mix. They tend to be quite loud and punchy in the mix. Very few cases I would recommend mixing the drums later. I think getting the drums right and then moving on to normally the bass line and then sort of the main hook creates this solid foundation for your hook to exist in. If you bring in the hook and then try and mix the bass to it and then try and mix the drums, it kind of feels like you're working backwards. So think of your drums as scaffolding for your music. So we start with those. And then within the drums, I mean, you can start with other ones, by the way. This is just my recommendation. And then inside that scaffolding of the drums, we want to start with the main hits. Now, I recommend kind of structuring your drums in terms of the channels with some sort of hierarchy. I put my clap at the top. Kick and clap at the top. Sometimes people put their kick out of their drums group. Have it nearby if it's not in the group. Kick, clap, main hats, a few of these more important loops, and then some more background percussion sounds, right? Might even put this one up here a little bit. Right, so let's kind of go through one by one, starting with the kick. It, again, is normally the main drum hit, right? It's just so integral to so many genres of electronic music. So if you get the kick as your starting point, and then normally the secondary hit, which is normally a snare or a clap, right? Right? And so you kind of just want to start going and adding with one thing at a time based on this hierarchy. So this way you'll focus on the 80% of things that matter the most, and then you'll kind of leave the 20%, more or less to, like we're placing less importance on those things, let's be honest, but we will still mix them, right? So let's get this clap up to scratch. I'm hearing personally here that the clap needs to be brought up in volume. So let's just do that. That sounds a little better to me now. I think there's some EQ work there that needs to be done, but we'll leave that for after the fader balancing. Right, let's go to the hats now, which again are probably the next most important element. They're providing a lot of the groove. Now this is a hats rack, so we've got 3 different hats on here. Let's see if we can kind of see which ones we might need to turn up and down. For example, this kind of offbeat hat here is probably a bit loud. Might even make the fade out on that a bit faster. Might bring down the shaker a little bit too. There we go, that feels a little better. And the overall balance feels pretty good where it is, to be honest. I wouldn't change that a lot. Maybe I'll give it a little boost. Okay, I'm actually gonna leave it where it is. Let's bring in loop 1 here, which is a kind of a percussive-y, kind of low-end loop. I think it's a little loud. I'm gonna bring it down. That feels a little better there. I brought it down 3.5. We still want to be able to hear it, but let's bring in some of these other ones and we'll see what we think. Bring down these shakers a little more. Again, we want less high end in the track. We bring down the shaker loop. I'm going to bring out this loop 1 for now. I want to hear how this loop and the hats interact. I think that may need a little more EQ work, but I'm going to leave it like that for now. Bring loop 1 down a little more. All right, loop 3. That's kind of layering up quite nicely with the hats. Bring it down 0.5 just so it kind of lets these main hats still poke through. Sounding nice. Let's bring up this break chopped sound. I think it's a bit loud, so we'll bring this down. Might need a bit of high pass filtering, but we'll bring it down even further for now. Bring it up a dB. I think it was a bit too quiet now. I want to hear that groove. Sounding good. Bring down the shakers yet even another dB. Yep, sounding good. All right, tonal percussion. I want this one to poke out a little bit because it creates almost like a melodic support for the other synths and stuff. Might bring it down a little bit, but not too much. I think that feels good there. We've got this noise sound, which is kind of like a nice little accent on the first 2 bars of each 4-bar phrase. I think it was a bit loud, so we'll see how what it sounds like when we bring it up. That needs to go way down. Like into the background, quite more so. Just a subtle element, right? Creating a bit of nice texture there, but really not taking up too much space in the mix. And then lastly, this Foley water sound I think was quite loud. I think it needs to go quite far down in the mix as well. Yeah. It's almost like a textural element rather than a drum element. There we go. I'm going to bring up our hats a little more. That feels really good there. I'm just doing a few little 0.2, 0.3 dB tweaks to really just let certain elements that I just feel like got a little bit buried once I brought in other elements pop, like this loop 3 here, which had some extra hats in it and a kind of a clap layer as well. Just want to add some bit more of the punch back. And this is starting to sound really good just as the drums, right? Now that is a solo drum arrangement. You can go back to the drums earlier in this video and compare what we've got here at this timestamp to what we got to where we were, sorry. And then we can start to bring in the second element. Again, I recommend bass here. So let's bring in our bass group, which in this case is 2 layers, a sub and a bass sound. I'm going to treat them as one, so I'm actually going to mix on the fader first, and then maybe I'll go and adjust the individual layers there if I need to. I think it was a tiny bit loud before. Needs a bit of sidechain though, so I may adjust the volume once I've added sidechain. I'll be covering sidechain later in this module, but generally speaking, that is feeling really solid. I might bring up the main layer a little bit more. Yeah, that's sounding really good. And then we can start to think about the music group. So let's bring on the bass. Turn off the crash for now. Bring in the main musical elements. Starting with the lead. Bit loud. I do want it to poke out in the mix. I want it to have a noticeably loud quality to it, but it's just a bit too much. So we brought it down about 1.5 dB now. I just want to start listening to see whether any of the lead is disappearing into the drums or the bass. I'm much more comfortable. So I brought that almost 2 dB down there, but it still feels good. We'll bring in this drone. Bring the lead up first, because I want that to be there. Bring the drone down. I'm putting the drone more into the mid ground, whereas the lead's in the foreground here. Yeah. And then we've got this chord, which is kind of a background element. Compare that to the bass. Might bring up the whole music group here just in comparison. Again, I want the relative volume to be good. Listen to it with the drums. Bit now with the drums there. Nice. And then lastly the crash cymbal. This will be in the background, kind of maybe mid ground, so we'll bring it down. There we go. And now let's listen to where we got to. And then at this point, I like to just make any last 0.5 dB adjustments to make any elements, particularly drums, that may be just getting a little lost. For example, I reckon just like an extra 2.2 dB on the kick. sounding brilliant to me. So that is fader balancing. That's my workflow. Again, that has done so much. So go back and compare it to the original version and see how much like more balance and control there is, how much more deliberate placements of different sound there is. So to recap, start with the 3 most important elements. In this case, it was drums, bass, melody, then mix everything else to it accordingly. Go through and hierarchically stack each element in each group, whether it's drums or bass sounds or melodic sounds. And then compare one by one, bring in new elements, mix it to what's there hierarchically, and you'll end up with a very solid result. I really hope this has shown you the power of fader balancing with their big changes or small changes like we've seen throughout this example. If you have any questions about this, send me an email or ask me on our next one-on-one. I'll be more than happy to demonstrate some more stuff in your specific genre if you would like. In the next lesson though, we're going to be talking about the fader only mix and how you can zero out all your faders if you're really in a pickle and you need to rehash your entire mix. So I'll demonstrate that for you briefly in the next lesson, and then we'll move on to EQ. I'll see you there. Now, this is just a brief lesson on doing a fader-only mix. If your mix is a dog's breakfast, it's terrible, you need to start again, you can zero out all the faders and start again. So I recommend when doing this to go up and save a new version. I could, for example, call it new or mix 2. We will do mix 2. And then I would go and get all your individual elements. Don't do this on your groups. On your individual elements, select them all, bring them all down to 0, right? So, I should say negative infinity in this case. So you want to make sure they're all at the bottom, right? Do not do this on your groups. Leave them at 0 because that is going to determine whether the sound comes through at all, right? You need that up. Otherwise, it won't work. But I do recommend setting all your groups to 0. In Ableton, you can select and press delete and it will bring it to 0. Then bring all the faders down to negative infinity. Right? Bass group to 0. There we go. There we go. Now, if you have sounds that are made of 2 layers, you can treat that group as 1 if you've balanced the sounds relatively. But for the sake of this lesson, we're just going to bring everything down to negative infinity. And now when you play, should have silence. And this is a brand new slate to mix from, right? Now, in terms of workflow, you pretty much do the exact same thing I mentioned in the last lesson. Start with the drums, then move on to the bass, then move on to your hook, whatever that may be, vocal, synth, lead, pad, whatever your hook is, combination of those things. But starting with your drums is important, again, with the main hit, your kick being the first thing you should bring in. Again, applies in any genre pretty much. So you bring your kick up. Now, I would say bring your kick up to 0. Depending on where it hits, in terms of volume, you may want to bring this down, maybe like -6. If your kick is hitting kind of between 0 and 6, ideally on the lower side of that, then generally everything else will balance out to a good absolute volume. So, we can see here on our kick channel, if we bring up the view, let's get our kick hitting at 6. And so that we're most likely going to have a bit of headroom once we start to add in other elements. And then move on to your clap. Important to mix with your ears, not your eyes here. There we go, bring up the hats. And so on and so forth. And you go through all of your elements, and then you go to your next element, your bass, and then you go to your lead or your hook or whatever, and mix like that. And this can often yield a very good result. You're not biased by your previous decisions when you do this too, which is very cool. right? And then bass, this up. And then your lead. Other elements. Other effects. There you go. That is a demonstration of the fader only mix. Again, very similar. You're just zeroing out all the faders beforehand. Yeah, nothing to recap. That's pretty much it. In the next lesson, I'm going to be talking about EQing and filtering, how to approach them simpling using the 1-1 rule. And I'll be showing you that there. See you then. So EQ is an important tool. Again, once you've got fader balancing sorted out, the next thing you'll want to go to is EQ. However, it's easy to go down the rabbit hole with EQ and spend so much time tweaking the fine controls of an EQ on a hat or a clap when it just isn't really making any noticeable difference. So the first thing you need to know when it comes to EQ is that not every element needs EQ. If you've selected a good sample, you've balanced that sample well in the mix, there's a good chance it may not need any EQ processing. So the first thing is to not assume that EQ is necessary, but to only look for a reason why you would want to use it at all. And if you find a reason, there's a second step you go through and asking yourself, what is the first EQ move I should make on this sound? Now, in a lot of cases in electronic dance music, the main type of cut or boost or whatever you want to call it will be a high pass filter. The reason is because high pass filters remove the low end from sounds, and in electronic music, we want to clear out the lows for the kick-bass relationship as much as possible. If we don't need anything in those low end frequencies in that particular sound, we should remove it. Now, this isn't a call to just, thoughtlessly apply EQ high pass filters to every sound in your mix. That's a mistake I've made in the past, and many producers tend to gravitate towards that because there's no harm in clearing at the low end. Well, again, coming back to the idea of the best processing is no processing, right? If we don't need to add a high pass filter, there are 100 reasons why I could say adding a high pass filter unnecessarily would be bad for your mix, whether it comes to phase destruction, whether it comes to destroying the transient. There's a whole host of reasons really why you wouldn't want to add EQ or at least a high pass filter to a sound. So don't go doing it willy-nilly, only use it when you want to. So what I'm going to do here is the same way I approached my fader balancing. I'm going to go through the most important elements to the least important elements in terms of my mix, starting with my drums, and just identify whether each sound progressively needs EQ. So I've got everything fader balanced, so that should be sweet. Let's start with the kick drum. We've got some tonal balance EQ on here, which is a little bit different. I'm not particularly hearing any major changes I'd like to make to the EQ. Maybe there's a bit too much of this honky low mid. Let's just double check. You know what? I don't think this needs any EQ. I think the kick is fine. Let's move on to the clap. Okay, so the clap, the first thing I'm hearing here is it's way too bright. So my first move here will be to do a high shelf reduction. I'm going to solo the band with my headphones icon here. Yeah. That's the stuff I want to get rid of, right? Now, I also want to add a bit more body to the clap. So I actually feel like I'm going to do a boost, which is not something I gravitate towards. Something I do by default is normally a cut. I normally take frequencies before I think of adding them. But in this case, I'm going to add some more around maybe 800 hertz. Yeah. Just to add a bit more body to the clap, right? And let's hear before and after, turning it off. and after. Yeah. Might bring down this boost a little bit. Way more balanced though. And so I've reduced the brightness, added a bit more body to the clap, and now it feels like it's present still, but it has more weight behind it. And that's what I've done there with EQ. Again, to hear it, and then with it on. Yeah, it just gets that clap in exactly the right spot I want. Let's move on to the hats. Now I've added an EQ here, which was just for a test I was doing before this. So I'm going to start from scratch. So the main thing I'm seeing here is just a resonance. So this is it's actually the same cut I had before, but there's a resonance here in the hats. I don't want to use a high shelf here. The main reason for that would be because I want to retain some of the air in the hats, right? I don't want to completely remove it, but these upper mids or highs, we could call them, they're just a bit pokey. So I want to get rid of them. And then I think there's a bit of low end in some of those hats in this rack here. Again, this is 3 samples that we're applying EQ to here. So I'm just going to add a high pass filter and kind of figure out where the best cutoff frequency is. If you're unsure what you're actually cutting out, you can use the headphones feature. Just so that low end artifact stuff, right? Now I'm going to use a subtle high shelf, just because I do want to tame some of those air band frequencies, just not as much as this resonance here. Yeah. All right, let's keep going through loop 1. This has lows in it still that we don't want. Maybe a few of these highs, but not too much. And notice the pattern here. In a lot of cases, I'm using one high pass filter and then one type of cut. I call this the 1-1 EQ rule. It's one high pass filter, one normally bell cut, maybe a shelf cut like I've done here. Just because I feel like most of the EQ moves you can make in your mix are going to be these two, right? Again, high pass filter first is the normal one, and then a cut as well if necessary. That kind of cleans that sound up. Next loop. Shakers. I'm actually going to use a low pass filter here to tame these really harsh high end frequencies. And that just cleans that up nicely there. You can see this is a very simple process. Again here, this loop, bit of a high pass filter, but nothing much. Pretty happy with that one. Again here, high pass filter, just to take out some of the lows of this break sample. Bit of a steeper one here to make sure we're targeting a very specific cutoff. Still want some of the lows in there, creating a bit of the groove. Always check your EQ changes in context. Let me just solo the drums. And so on. Obviously, you would then move on to the bass and give that what it needs. I'm going to treat this like one element, and I feel like the bass needs a bit of a high-end boost with the high shelf. Maybe a bit of a mid boost too. Listen in context. Sounding really, really good there. So to recap, not everything in your track needs EQ, but when you do need EQ, identify what the main move you can make is, and try to use the 1-1 EQ rule, where you do one high pass filter and one EQ cut to make the biggest moves in your EQ process. You don't want to be spending hours EQing one element to perfection, because it's probably not going to happen. EQ is not a tool for perfection. It is a tool. And there's no 100% perfect EQ for any one sound. I think a lot of people believe that myth, but it's just not true. So that is it for EQ. Hopefully you can see how it's a tool in your arsenal. It's a very powerful tool. It's like blending almost like the frequencies in your mix, right? If you want more low end in your mix, you turn up the kick, you turn up the bass. If you want more highs, you turn up the hats, the loops, the effects, right? If you want more mids, you turn up the leads. Well, EQ allows you to control that on an individual level and get each element pumping, pushing in the right frequencies. So it's a tool. Great. In the next one, we're going to be jumping over to dynamics. We're going to be covering compressors, saturators, and limiters, and how these different tools can solve a variety of different dynamic problems you'll encounter as a producer. Great. Can't wait to share that with you, and I'll see you very soon. All right. So dynamics tools. We have to talk about this very overhyped, but still important plethora of tools that you can use in your arsenal. Now, the reason I'm saying dynamics and not specifically just compression is because there's more than one type of tool you can use to control the dynamics in your mix. And compressors aren't always the number one tool, although they tend to be the most talked about for some reason. Now, we're going to talk about three different types. We're going to talk about compressors. We're going to be talking about saturators / clippers. We're going to be talking about limiters. Right, so starting with a compressor. Now, this isn't going to be a masterclass on how to use each of these three tools. We're going to be covering over on a high level how these three tools work. So if we loaded, say, a compressor on our kick drum here, right? Now I'm going to set this up so that we can see it applying to the kick drum. So we've got it on our activity view here, which is Ableton's compressor. You know, most DAW's compressors will show you some sort of movement as the signal is being compressed, whether it's like a gain reduction meter, just simply like that, or whether it's with a more historical view like that, okay? So a compressor turns down loud parts of the sound, and the reason you would want to do this is to even out the dynamics of a sound. If you think of a square wave being played in a synth, right, with no envelope on it, so it's just like bam, bam, using a compressor is kind of pointless because there's no dynamics to control, right? It's just on off. But the reality is a lot more natural sounds, anything with a decay, like you can see this kick gets quieter over time, this clap gets quieter over time. A lot of these sounds have loud and quiet parts that all decay over time. This is where compression is helpful because we can turn down those peaks and make a more consistent sound. Now, the point with compression isn't to turn everything into a flat sausage. It's to simply control parts of the sound that stick out and create a bit more evenness, right? Now, if we wanted to do this, say on the kick drum, we would control this with the threshold. So the threshold determines how much of the signal is being compressed, how loud it has to be before it starts engaging. I'm going to bring the attack down here in the release up just to demonstrate this, right? So we can see this. Right? It's turning down the parts that exceed the threshold. If we bring it up here, and then we can bring up the ratio to see how much it's going to be turned down, right? So at a certain point, which is determined by the threshold, how much is the signal being ducked by? You can see with the ratio at 4 there, it's a lot more. At a smaller ratio, it's less. And it's more exaggerated the lower the threshold is, right? Right? I find a 4:1 ratio is pretty good for a lot of circumstances, between 2 and 4:1. For every 1 dB going over, it's going to either half or quarter it, right? So 2, 4. And that is the basics of how a compressor works. Now, there may be certain cases where I wanted to use this for a particular purpose. For example, one thing in this track is we've got a chopped break sample here. Now, this break sample is quite dynamic. We can see a lot of quiet parts, a lot of loud parts. And I would want to compress it to even it out. So I'm going to set up my compressor here to kind of just give it a bit of a massage. I think a ratio of 3:1 is kind of appropriate. For every 1 dB or every 3 dB going over the threshold here, it's going to go down to 1 dB. So think of it like that. I'm going to bring the attack and release. Now, this is where I'll cover attack and release and how they work. Attack is how long the compressor takes to engage, and a release is how long it takes to disengage. So if we have a long attack, like let's say 100 milliseconds, it's going to let the first part of the sound through before it turns things down. This is great if you're wanting to add punch to a sound. It's actually going to emphasize the beginning of sounds even more. But if we want to control a sound, you want to use a shorter attack time, something that's really going to grab things. Now, you might think, why don't just use the minimum? Why not just use instant compression? Well, instant compression sounds very unnatural. See how the sound just instantly kind of like feels squished? Adding a bit of attack, depending on the type of sound, makes things sound a little natural while still controlling the sound. And then release is kind of a weird one. It's hard to hear release when you're kind of new to compression, but generally the longer the release, the more squashed it's going to remain sounding, right? So if we have a very long release, right, we could even bring up the ratio to really intense. It's almost hard to hear the compression because it's engaged pretty much all the time. Whereas if we have a shorter kind of 1 to 200 millisecond release, you hear the volume coming back up at the end of the sounds, giving it more of a pumping effect. Right? And this is why when you're using shorter releases, you want to have less compression going on. So I'm going to bring the ratio down back to about 4. We can see here with the threshold we're setting, we're just compressing those louder hits. And we can hear that before and after. The sound just feels more forward in the mix. Now, of course, I could go ahead and blend this dry wet back to kind of control the amount of the original unprocessed signal comes in. This is a great way to ensure that the sound still sounds natural. If you do this and kind of over compress the sound, it can be a nice way to kind of blend the effect back so it doesn't sound so intense. And so we can see here, compression actually sounds quite subtle in a lot of cases, right? It's not a crazy effect that we're trying to completely change the sound with. Although we can definitely set it up that way, that's not what you really want to use it for. So I'm actually really liking the effects settings I've got here on this compressor. Bring down the dry wet, and let's hear how that sounds in the mix. Feels like a bit of the detail to me of the break sample is poking out. A little bit more movement, which I'm actually really enjoying the sound of. Right, so that's a compressor and a use case for it. Now, another type of dynamics control is limiting. Now, a limiter is basically a full speed ahead compressor, right? It is a compressor with a ratio of infinity to 1 that engages instantly. Now, a lot of the mistakes producers make when they look at, say, a limiter, whether it's your stock limiter like Ableton's limiter here, or Logic or FL Fruity limiter, you know, a lot of those limiters have attack settings. Some of them don't, like Ableton's limiter only has the release. But the confusing thing is, well, if a limiter engages instantly and allows nothing to go over this 0 dB threshold, so that's what a limiter does. It doesn't allow anything over 0 dB. It's limiting the audio to that maximum point of loudness. Why would you need an attack control? Well, the attack control on a limiter is not how long the limiter takes to engage. Instead, the attack control on a limiter is determining how long it will take the release phase to engage. So you can think of attack as more of a hold. I would actually call it hold in a lot of times. It's kind of like limiter engages instantly. Attack determines how long it stays limited, and then the release starts to ease off the limiting, right? So this all happens at a very fast time scale. You know, we're talking, a quarter of a second, half a second, if not faster. And limiters are much better at controlling dynamics, although they have a lot more of a drastic effect on the sound. So an example of where we might want to use a limiter is, besides our master, is maybe say on our drums group, we want to kind of control the loudness, control the peaks of some of our drum hits. We might add it on our drums. You can see here that there's a lot of inconsistency to the drums, so this is a great way to make sure they're kind of an all even volume. And the cool thing with some of the more advanced limiters, which are usually referred to as brick wall limiters, this is in contrast to a classic limiter, which is a little less strict than a brick wall limiter. A brick wall limiter is strict in the sense that nothing will get over 0 dB, whereas an old school limiter might let a few pokes or peaks through 0 dB and it would still create a bit of clipping, right? A lot of the old school limiters would be a ratio of, say, 10:1 rather than a ratio of infinity to 1, so it's more of a relaxed limiter, you can think. But most modern limiters, FabFilter Pro L2 included, Ozone's limiter, the AOM Invisible limiter, a lot of those limiter plugins will be brick wall limiters. They are very strict. And so you can see here, if I solo my drums group, nothing is going over 0 dB. It's stuck at that because of this limiter. And that's where you want to use limiter when you're trying to maximize the loudness or control peaks, right? It's not the thing you want to use in every case. I find it best used on drums, whether on your group or on individual hits, because drums tend to sound a lot better when limited. I wouldn't be going ahead and using a limiter on your piano, because pianos, when they go into a limiter, are often going to sound distorted and not very nice, unless you know how to dial in the settings. I would much rather opt for compressors on things like pianos and other musical sounds, whereas drums, I feel like limiters are a great way to control and even out your drums. Obviously, we use limiters on our master to get our track up to a standard level of loudness, but you're welcome to use them in the mix as well. So that's limiters. The last type of dynamics control effect is probably the most intense, and this is a clipper or a saturator. Now, in Ableton specifically, we have a couple of devices that can function as this. However, I'm going to use the, I think it's called G-Clip plugin. If I can find it here. Here we go, G-Clip. Now, clipping is technically a form of distortion, not a form of dynamic control, but it does have a dynamic control component to it. Now, why would you want to do something to a sound that's going to just add distortion? Well, if we use clipping or saturation, depending on how you look at it the right way, it's actually a very effective way to control the loudness of certain elements. Yes, it's the most intense and probably destructive form of dynamic control, but for certain styles of electronic music, this is actually what we want. In fact, a lot of genres of electronic music, as their final plugin, instead of a limiter, will use a clipper. This is particularly true in genres like rhythm, dubstep, and even drum and bass, and other bass music genres, right? And so a clipper, unlike a limiter, is basically 100% brutal. A limiter is smart in the sense that it doesn't distort easy. It tries to keep the feel of the audio with intelligent algorithm design. A clipper is kind of like the chainsaw approach to a limiter. It just chops anything off that goes over the threshold, right? And so if I have my clipper on my drums here, hear how this sounds when I increase the clip amount. So clip is going to bring basically the threshold down. So the more the threshold, obviously the more distortion we get. Now the cool thing is, even at 80%, look at this graph on the right here and see what you notice. I don't know about you, but I can't hear any obvious changes in the audio. However, if we look at the graph, we can see that some of these peaks are actually being clipped. And this is because what a clipper is very good at doing is taking these instantaneous peaks that we can't really perceive as humans and chop them off, basically, without any real audible destruction to the audio signal. This is great because it allows us to control the dynamics of certain, particularly drums again, maybe basses as well, without making crazy changes to the sound of the drums, right? I can't hear anything. This means when we were to use a limiter on the master, we're going to be allowing the limiter to work a lot less hard because we're controlling the dynamics of these weird instantaneous peaks that can be present in certain samples, in certain synths, etc. So this is where clipping is very helpful. Like I said, you can use a more aggressive form of clipping to actually push the loudness quite far as well. So if I brought the clip up to 100%, and brought the gain up, so this will be at 0 dB now. I'm going to enable oversampling to show this because it will potentially create some artifacts. Watch what happens when I bring the gain up. Again, turn your headphones down here at this point because this may get a bit loud. Apologies in advance. Now we can start to hear distortion at this point, right? However, certain genres actually call for that kind of distortion on their drums, on their master, so that they can get to a greater level of loudness. If you're trying to get to, say, -4, -3, negative even 2 LUFS, which I've seen before on a track, clipping is how you do it. There's only so far you're going to be able to get with a limiter like Pro L2 or Ozone's maximizer, right? Clipping is kind of necessary in certain genres. And so that's how you can get to a greater level of loudness. Again, more stripped back genres like this melodic house style here, probably it's not the greatest tool for that particular purpose because one, melodic house isn't that loud in comparison, and two, we want to keep the natural non-distorted sound of our drums, of our basses, and pretty much any other element. However, at smaller amounts, just to control a bit of dynamic variation, a few peaks, a little bit of clipping in the right amount can be good, like we saw earlier. So in that sense, clippers and limiters have a similar function. I'll actually leave a video link down below to explain this to you more in detail. But there's a great deal of difference as well. And you have to know when you want to use either. Basically, if you want a more safe result, a limiter is better. If you want a louder result, a clipper is better. And then beyond those two, a compressor I would tend to use throughout the mix on buses to just massage certain sounds together rather than kind of brutalize them or control all of the peaks in a very strict way. You know, there's a difference between when you're going to go for a, brick wall approach or more of a subtle approach. And again, using compressors throughout your mix means your limiters and clippers at other stages in the track are going to have to work less hard, which is a good thing. You don't want your final limiter to be the only thing controlling the dynamics in your mix. If you haven't done good fader balancing, good EQ, and then good dynamics control in the mix, it's not going to be helpful to use just limiting on your master. And so those are the 3 types of things you can do. Again, there's a number of reasons you might want to use any 3 of these tools. I'm going to quickly reel them off for you now. Again, we saw controlling peaks. Clippers and limiters are great for controlling peaks. You can also use a more aggressive, fast attack version of a compressor to control peaks on a sound or a group of sounds. You can add punch by using a fast attack compressor. This is a great way to add more transients to your snares, your kicks, and stuff like that. I do recommend using a second limiter afterwards to kind of not create too many crazy dynamics. So if you're going to do a compressor to add punch, use a limiter afterwards. Definitely a very helpful tool. Another great way to use any of these dynamic tools is to even out natural dynamics. So if you've got a vocal, a piano, any recorded sound, whether you recorded it or it's a sample, compression can be a great way to even out dynamics. The attack and release, the threshold and ratio settings are very much going to depend on what that sound is, how big the dynamic variation is. Again, I'm going to leave some more resources on compression and stuff like that if you don't know how to use the basics of a compressor. Very helpful. Another great thing you can do with the compressor is add glue in Ableton. That's why there is a glue compressor. This is an analog style compressor that is a bit more natural in how it works, unlike the standard Ableton compressor, which is very scientific and kind of cold. It does what it says it's going to do. The glue compressor does not. It's a bit more, what we call program dependent. It's very dependent on what's coming in via the input to it. And this is a great tool to, say, compress your drums group, control it a little bit, kind of make all the elements feel like they're moving together as one. Compression has that effect of evening things out and making things feel like one element, which is pretty cool. The other awesome thing is that if you drive the makeup gain, glue compressor has a soft clip on the output, which is, again, clipping. Really, really cool. And then another last thing is to add loudness. That's where limiters and clippers really shine, is that adding loudness factor, right? Depending on how loud you want to go will determine which plugin you use and at which point. I personally use a combination of both depending on the style I make, depending on whether I'm doing it on my master or on my group or on my individual channel level. That will very much determine what device and what settings I use there. So there's a few different reasons. So to recap, there are 3 dynamics control devices. There is a compressor, limiter, and clipper, right? These can be used in different ways to different varying degrees to control different problems in your mix. And I'll leave you with this thought. Whilst we have all these tools, we have to think about this. In electronic music, the dynamics are very consistent, as we covered way back earlier in this module. So if you are thinking every channel needs a compressor, every channel needs a limiter, you're likely wrong. The thing is, a lot of these samples we're using here have compression, dynamics, even other processing applied to them to even them out already. Even if we listen to this kick drum here, right? I'm not necessarily hearing a need to add a limiter, a compressor. I think it sounds good on its own. Even this clap. It sounds full to me. I don't think I need to add a compressor or a limiter at the individual stage. And this is my plea to you. In 90% of cases, I truly believe you don't need to use a limiter or a compressor. If you're picking a good quality sound, whether it's a preset, or a sample, a synth, an instrument, whatever it may be, as long as it's not a raw sound, which in a lot of cases it's not, like a raw drum kit recorded or a raw vocal, you won't need to use compression. It will already have it either baked into it or an even enough dynamic signal that you don't really need to control it, especially in the case of synths. So really question whether a compressor, a limiter, or a clipper is actually going to help you get to what you want. For example, this drums group here, we can hear a lot more dynamic variation in the overall drums than we can on an individual channel. So compression or limiting or clipping may be more appropriate to use at bus levels rather than individual levels, because the sum of the parts is creating the dynamic variation rather than the individual elements themselves, right? Interesting thing to think about. And so that's why fader balancing and EQ are far more important than adding dynamics control. But at the same time, you do need them at very strategic points, particularly again on the groups and on your master. Great. Check out some of the bonus resources down below, going into more of these tools. Apart from that, thank you for watching this lesson. I know it's probably been a lot. In the next lesson, we're going to be talking about sidechain compression, which is how we can use a compressor to duck sounds out of the way from each other, especially with kick bass. This is very important. You may be familiar with it, you may not be. We're going to be going over how to set that up pretty much universally in every DAW. It's pretty much the same, and different alternatives for doing that in your mix too. So I can't wait to see you then. So now's the time to go and apply what you've just learned to your next track. Focus on the fader balancing, the EQ, and the dynamic control, and see where you get to. You'll be pleasantly surprised, I think. And with that, thanks for watching this lesson. If you do want to learn more about my 12-week Producer Launchpad coaching program, click the link below where you can find out everything and even book a free application call with me. We can chat on a Zoom call, figure out your goals, and see whether you'll be a good fit for the program. Until next time, happy producing.